Hello, this talk is on the Siege of Savage's Old Fields. It's on an article I published with the Journal of the American Revolution. So if you're interested in the sources or going into a little bit more depth, you can read it there. It is a free online journal. I do want to know also one reason I wanted to publish this is that it was in the 2025 that I wrote this and had it published for the 250th anniversary of the first battle of 96, also known as the Siege of Savage's Old Fields. And I'm a professor at Lander University, and a colleague of mine, or I shouldn't say a colleague, but a predecessor of mine, published a similar article in 1975 for the 225th anniversary. So I wanted to kind of continue that tradition. So the events we're going to be focusing on in this talk occurred in 1775, but I'm actually going to start around 1780, and it will be clear why shortly. So in that period, in the American War for Independence, there was an attempt to follow Germain's Southern strategy, right? Britain was following what was called the Southern strategy. And they did this for a couple of reasons. One is that they were just not doing that well in mid-Atlantic states and in New England. They were just really struggling in the North, and it didn't seem like they could win there. In the South, there was a belief that there was a large number of loyalists who would rise up and help them if they would just send regular troops so the loyalists could come out. And the results they hoped for was either A, they would then be able to take the South, make it into a base from which they could retake the North, or B, if they couldn't retake the North, but they could take the South, they could enter a negotiated settlement and the Southern colonies would still be a part of the British Empire, even if the Northern ones became independent. So this is a map from the American Battlefield Trust, and you can see that a lot of battles in the Southern campaign are going to happen in South Carolina. And a key commander for the Patriots, and one reason why the Patriots are going to win the Southern campaign, is a man named Nathaniel Greene. And one way to think about Nathaniel Greene is that he was a good loser. And I don't mean that he, would shake hands and say good game after a battle. Rather, he was able, despite losing battles, I think he lost every major engagement that he fought in the Southern campaign, he could always keep his army together and keep its morale high. Right? He understood that the Americans could win, or I should say the Patriot forces could win, if they just stayed alive. If they didn't lose, they would win, because the British would eventually get tired and have to give up, right? The British have to bring a lot of soldiers over from Britain or from Europe if they're bringing in the German forces. That takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and there's limits there. For the American Patriots, they can raise a lot more troops. So he knows if he can keep an army in the field, keep it going, then the Americans, or the Patriots, are able to outlast the British. So here's a couple quotes. I run as fast backwards as forwards to convince our enemy that we are like a crab. We can run in any direction as long as it is away. So the idea here is that wear out your enemy. Try not to fight unless you absolutely have to, because every month in the field, they lose people they can't replace through sickness and things like that, whereas we could replace our losses. And then, of course, he has this famous quote, "We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again." And he's similar in that sense to George Washington, right? Washington lost more battles than he won, but his major ability was to keep the army around, to keep it as a threat and a focus of national unity. So very similar commander, and it's no surprise that he was that Nathaniel Greene was actually something of a disciple of George Washington, was someone Washington really liked. So the thing about Greene I want to emphasize is that this strategy that says, well, we're just going to outlast the enemy, we're not going to worry about winning a decisive battle that it finishes the war quickly. We're saying we're going to continue the war. We know we're going to lose people. We may lose more people in the British. It's okay because we can replace the losses. That's a kind of cold-hearted perspective, right? I mean, it's a strategy that worked. It was effective, but I just want to emphasize, and I'm not saying this to criticize Greene, this is some kind of cold calculation with human lives, right? So I want to emphasize that so that we understand Greene was a objective thinker. He could be detached when he needed to in order to figure out how to win. So in the War of the South, when he says this quote, and I'll read it, The whole country is in danger of being laid waste by the Whigs and Tories, who pursue each other with as much relentless fury as beasts of prey. This is not coming from someone who's not seen violence. This is not coming from someone who is overly emotional. This is coming from a man who realizes that he can only win by prolonging the war, which he knows will kill a lot of people, but that's what's necessary to win, because the British can't replace their people while the Americans can, right? That's saying something then when he says this. And then historian John, and I want to stress when Greene says this, he's commenting on partisan, that is guerrilla warfare, which was a lot of what was going on in South Carolina, especially the backcountry. And historian John Pancake mentions, this observation was made by Nathaniel Greene, a man already hardened by 6 years of war. In those 6 years, Greene had never seen anything like the Civil War that raged in the Carolinas. Nowhere in America was the fighting more bitter and savage. And to give you an example of this, what Greene was referring to, what Pancake is referring to, we have the Battle of Waxhaws. And this is a screenshot from Wikipedia. And in this, you can see, if you just look at casualties and losses, right, the Americans lose so many more than the British. And I shouldn't say British, I should actually say Crown forces. Most of the British forces under Banastre Tarleton, who himself was British, most of the men he was leading were loyalists, right? They were Americans. And there's an argument about what exactly happened here, but it is clear that there was some sort of massacre. How much it was planned, how much it was accidental, why it happened is not completely clear. But when you look at the numbers here, this is a massacre, right? This is a massacre. When you have more than 2 killed for every 1 captured in this way and so many wounded, there was some serious violence going on after the battle was over. And that's what we have. So let's now return to 1775 and the siege of Savage's Old Fields. This battle lasted from November 19th to November 22nd. Sometimes you'll see it November 21st. That was the last night of fighting, but they don't actually have their negotiated truce until the morning of the 22nd. So that's why I give the 22nd. The Associator forces numbered about 562, and I'll talk about what I mean by that later, but those are the equivalent of the Patriots or the Whigs, depending on what you want to call them. The Loyalists were thought to have between 1,500 to 2,000. We don't really have accurate numbers of the Loyalists. We don't have records of their perspective. We do of the Associator forces, and this is based on a roster that they provided. So this is an impression rather than a careful count. But the key thing we do need to know is that the Loyalists did outnumber the Associators. Even if the Loyalists were half their numbers, this would still mean that we had more than 1,000 men fighting for several days, right? This is pretty serious stuff. These men would have included people who knew how to shoot and fight. A lot of these people are from the backcountry. A lot would be familiar with hunting. And so we can expect that they would know how to use their weapons well. And if we were to, a battle of similar scale, you could say was Guilford Courthouse, and that killed about 60 people. So I want you to think for a second. I just read for you all these information about how 1780 we had a very violent South Carolina backcountry. If a battle that was similar in scale but not in time, Guilford Courthouse lasted fewer days than Savage's Old Fields, and it killed 60. How many do you think the siege of Savage's Old Fields killed? It had about the same number of people, but lasted longer. So I'll give you a second. We only know of 2 deaths in the siege of Savage's Old Fields. James Birmingham on the Patriot Whig Associator side, and Captain Looper, who would be on the Loyalist side. So this raises the question, why so few? You would think that there would be more, right? If it had the same number of people as Guilford Courthouse, approximately, but lasted longer, you would think it would have about the same number of deaths or even more. But instead we have so few, especially when we consider how violent the backcountry was. So what was different about the South Carolina backcountry in 1775? Why is it that the numbers are so low? So to talk about that, I need to talk about some politics. So in April 1775, we had the battles of Lexington and Concord, the first blood being shed by people actually shooting at each other, right? You have the militia, Patriot militia fighting with regular British forces. And South Carolina will react to this and other events. Basically, what happens is there's going to be a split in the South Carolina government. There'll be the royal governor on one side, that's the official crown governor, versus the provincial Congress, which is going to be the group that's the what we might call the Patriots or the Whigs or the Associators. To give you a sense of how the balance was, the royal governor was forced to flee to a ship, which shows that the provincial Congress is basically going to be in charge. In June 30th, 1775, the provincial Congress will issue this very long document, which is publicly available, a circular letter to the committees in the several districts and parishes of South Carolina. That letter references the Battle of Lexington Concord and uses that as an example of how bad things have gotten, of the need to set up their own kind of government, and of the need to respond to such violence committed by British forces. And here's how it's justified with a quote. British ministers, in pursuit of their plan to enslave America, in order that they might enslave Great Britain, to elevate the monarch that has been placed on a throne only to govern under the law, into a throne above all law. So you'll notice here that in justifying their actions, they're not actually criticizing the king himself. They're saying there's bad ministers who want to use the king to enslave America and Great Britain. That's a key point, right? There's this idea that there's these bad ministers misleading the king rather than the monarchy or British rule itself being bad. Now, there were people in the provincial Congress, there were South Carolina men of influence who really wanted to declare independence at this point, right? They wanted to declare independence, but there's a moderate group that doesn't think that step needs to be taken yet. So for now, they are avoiding criticizing the king and just focusing on what they say are bad ministers. However, in order to deal with these British actions, the provincial Congress in this letter says they need to develop a military force and create an association of people who accepted the provincial Congress. Now, the use of the term associators would come into being for those who took the oath of loyalty to the provincial Congress. This would then, the kind of strategy behind this, it exposes people who remain loyal to the crown. So it tells you who your friends are and who your enemies are if you're a supporter of the provincial Congress, while pressuring fence sitters to take a side, right? You either take the oath or you don't, right? There's no neutrality here. That's what they're trying to get rid of. They're trying to get rid of a neutral space. And the problem is that there's a lot of fence sitters in the backcountry, right? There's a lot of people who really just don't want to have anything to do with that. And if they were push came to shove, would actually lean more towards the king. But the key thing is you've got this violence that takes place in Lexington Concord. You've got this growing kind of separate government in South Carolina that's using that violence and the problems with the British government to justify raising military forces, and then wants to also get people to take an oath of loyalty. And it moves fast with the military forces it raises. On July 12th, the provincial forces will seize Fort Charlotte and its swivel guns and gunpowder. Now, you can't see Fort Charlotte today, but there is this wonderful kind of monument to it. This nice, I'm not sure what to call it exactly, but this nice sign where Fort Charlotte's now under water, but this shows you where it would approximately have been at and what it would have looked like. And it's also important to note, people did not have a huge amount of gunpowder, right? They had the gunpowder that they needed for their kind of everyday needs, but not enough for the war that was maybe looming. So gunpowder was a very, very important commodity. And so there was really, really a strong interest in the provincial forces of that Congress getting to the fort and seizing the gunpowder, right? Because there's not enough gunpowder. And keep that in mind. This resource is extraordinarily important. If you've studied the American Revolution, you know that Washington early in the war constantly complained about not having enough gunpowder. Swivel guns were also at Fort Charlotte, and these will be seized by the Associated or the Whig Patriot forces. And they're very important. This is a swivel gun, and that's me firing the swivel gun with the help of a couple of my fellow living historians. And the thing about swivel guns, you look at the swivel gun, you may say, That's not particularly impressive. That is a very small cannon. That's about as small as a swivel gun gets. The ones, I believe, at 96 would have been a bit bigger. But the key thing is it's not a terribly large cannon. That doesn't mean it's ineffective. It has a particular job to do. It has a range comparable to a rifle. So pretty long-ranged weapon. You could follow a solid ball out of it if you so chose, or you could fire bits and pieces of metal, something like grape shot, also if you wanted to. It can be loaded very quickly by a very small crew, so that's one of its big advantages. If you don't care about safety procedures, you could probably fire this thing very easily 3 to 4 times a minute. And the big thing about it that makes it really important is its mobility. You can carry this physically during a battle to a place where you need to put it, right? To a place where it's needed. You don't need horses to move this thing around on a battlefield. A cannon carriage would be very difficult to move to the left or right, but this literally is on a swivel. You can just move it with your hand. And of course, to get it to the battlefield, instead of needing like 8 horses to pull it, you need 1 horse to carry it. And if it was a light enough model, you could just take turns having guys carry it. So this is a very mobile weapon. It has firepower and range greater than a lot of other weapons on the battlefield. Lots of killing power, and lots of range. So this is a very effective weapon, and one reason why the associators wanted it. Now, what's striking about the Battle of Fort Charlotte is that the taking of Fort Charlotte is there's no casualties. Right? You have groups of armed men confronting each other over very important resources, and no one, not only is no one killed, no one is wounded, and no shots are even fired. And this is from a reenactment of the surrender of Fort Charlotte. So that in itself, I think, is very, very impressive. Now, to give us a sense of where we are geographically speaking, that arrow on the bottom left, that is where Fort Charlotte is. The arrow on the upper right is where the 96 is, and this is from the McCormick 250th anniversary website. So what's important to also think about with Fort Charlotte is the aftermath. So the person who led the seizure of Fort Charlotte was a man named Major James Mason, and he's going to take some gunpowder from Fort Charlotte to Fort 96. While there, Moses Kirkland, a militia officer who had accompanied Mason in the taking of Fort Charlotte, along with other loyalists, including the brothers Robert and Patrick Cunningham, are going to arrest Mason and place him in the jail there. Now, he's later going to be released. I think he's there just for a day or two. And this tells us several things. One is that not everyone supported the Associators, right? Moses Kirkland certainly didn't, and the other loyalists didn't, and they had the power to be able to arrest Mason. It also wasn't clear who was on what side, right? Remember, Moses Kirkland helped to seize the swivel guns and gunpowder at Fort Charlotte. His exact decision process is not clear, but later he's going to arrest his commanding officer, right? So it's not clear who's on what side. Moreover, remember, independence has not been declared. It's not clear what the sides are. It's not entirely clear what killing each other is going to accomplish. And so we still see here, people did not want to resort to bloodshed. Even though Moses Kirkland obviously sees James Mason as a threat, he doesn't kill him. There's no shooting, right? There's nothing like that. And I want to stress, in 1780, there were plenty of times when the loyalists and the patriots in the backcountry would have killed each other or hung each other with or without trial. So, but at this stage, we don't see it. And a lot of these people knew each other, and that might be one reason why. So this tells the Provincial Congress that there is unrest in the backcountry, that some people don't like the Associators and don't like the Provincial Congress, or at least want to be left alone. So in July 23rd, William Drayton and Reverend William Tennant, Presbyterian minister, will be sent out to the backcountry to win hearts and minds for the association. They're going to go around, and Tennant actually left behind a fairly detailed account of his journeys, talking about how things went. They meet with limited success. They do find some people who support them, some people who like them, other people who don't. But they're going to meet only with limited success. So most of the documents we have are from the associator perspective. There is an example, though, of a loyalist perspective in response to a letter sent by William Drayton, that representative to Thomas Fletchel, a loyalist. And in his response, basically William Drayton says, hey, are you willing to accept the provincial Congress and take the oath? And Thomas Fletchel responds, I must inform you, sir, I am resolved and do utterly refuse to take up arms against my king until I find it my duty to do otherwise and am fully convinced thereof. Now, this is hardly a ringing endorsement of loyalism, right? Because he says, I will not take up arms against the king. He doesn't say, I will take up arms for the king. He just says, I will not take them against the king unless I'm convinced otherwise. Even so, this still runs a real risk, right? He's still saying, I'm not going to take the oath. It does seem, though, to some point, like he just really wants to be left alone. So tensions are going to rise in the backcountry. Both the associators and men like Thomas Fletchel, the so-called king's friends, will begin organizing and embodying, meaning they're going to start getting weapons and training and forming military units. On September 13, William Drayton will issue a proclamation against the King's Friends organizing. He says, provincial Congress is taking care of the military. You're outside of that. You shouldn't be doing that. But he does so in a fairly conciliatory way, again, blaming the ministers, and he actually backs off. He's not even that critical of the king at all. And on September 14th, there is a Treaty 96 signed between Drayton and Fletchel. However, the treaty really heavily favors the associators. And I'm not going to go through every item in the treaty, but I do want to note the Loyalists promised not to support British regulars if they came to restore Crown rule. That's kind of a big thing, right? We're not going to help the British if they come to try and restore the rightful government, right? If you're a Loyalist, that's what you see it as. The Loyalists promised to recognize the legitimacy of the Provincial Congress and any future arrests it might make of Loyalists. That's, again, very striking. And many Loyalists, as you can guess, would disagree with this, right? The whole point of being a Loyalist is that you will support the British government, that you will recognize the British government and not the Provincial Congress. Robert Cunningham, right, remember he was involved in that incident at 96 with the arrest of Mason, will receive a letter from Drayton asking whether he accepted this treaty, since he was a known Loyalist leader. And he responded, I do not hold with that peace. And as you can see here, he says Drayton was scared. Other people will say Fletchel was scared. Other people will say, well, Fletchel was drunk. The key thing is here, Cunningham says, I don't hold with that peace. And Fletchel responds by arranging things so that that Cunningham will have his arrest be ordered, right? So the Provincial Congress orders the arrest of Cunningham. He's captured by Andrew Williamson, Major Andrew Williamson. He's going to be the guy that's actually commanding at 96 during the battle we're going to talk about. So that's why I mentioned his name. And he's thrown into jail in Charleston. The arrest of Cunningham makes Drayton feel it is safe to shift his attention to relations with the Cherokee. He wants to keep them neutral if there is fighting between British or Loyalist forces. He wants to make sure they're neutral. If he can get them to side on the side of the Patriots, that's so much the better. But mostly the goal is to keep them neutral. And so he will send a lot of gunpowder and lead as gifts. Now, from his perspective, these are just gifts to help the Cherokee with their hunting. But from the perspective of Loyalists, this looks like the associators, the Patriots, are arming Native Americans to fight with them. And so this is very upsetting. So Patrick Cunningham, Robert's brother, will ambush the caravan that's bringing that gunpowder and that lead to the Cherokee, will ambush it and seize the supplies. Anything they can't carry off, they try and destroy. Remember, I want to emphasize gunpowder is really important during this time period. What's striking again is no one is harmed. Again, this is another time when you have armed men, very important resources are at stake. No one is injured. No one is killed. In fact, no one is even taken prisoner. The loyalists just grab the stuff and leave, and they leave the wagoneers and their guards and just go. So associator forces would be sent out then to try and arrest Patrick Cunningham after this. At the same time, the king's friends are also going to organize more. So I just want to review we're getting up to the point of the battle. Why don't we have any casualties so far, right? This is key to understanding the battle and then understanding why casualties will first come into being. So we've had several dangerous situations involving a significant number of angry men with guns who are contesting important resources. So why no deaths? One thing I would argue is their differing goals. The king's friends seem to have largely wanted to be left alone rather than to wage an actual war against the associators. The associators sought to isolate loyalist leaders while winning the support of the white population of the backcountry. Should the loyalists turn to violence, that would invite a stronger push by the provincial congress into the backcountry, while violent acts by the Whigs would undercut their conciliatory approach. In other words, violence doesn't make sense for either group, right? The loyalists would just bring in more trouble. The Whigs are trying to win over loyalists, so being too violent is going to hurt that approach. And since there was as yet no Declaration of Independence, it was not entirely clear where the lines of loyalty lay. There's some other factors too. Since the 1750s, backcountry whites and some African Americans had fought against the Cherokee and other Native Americans. When those raids and counter-raids ceased temporarily, there was a rise in criminal gangs. The planter elites in the Low Country did not want the expansion of legal system in the backcountry. That's in part what made that possible, that rise in criminal gangs. That then led in turn to the regulator movement as a response, where you basically had people in the backcountry forming their own vigilante posses to deal with the rising crime. This ends with the establishment of courts and jails in the backcountry. They're finally able to overcome that resistance to the planter elite, and that was largely possible because of united political action by the people in the backcountry. So what you can see, my point here is that all these social forces in the backcountry encourage unity, not division. Right? The backcountry people are being taught constantly over the decades, we got to stick together. Right? We got to stick together if we want to defend ourselves against Native American raids or engage in counter raids. We need to stick together if we want to protect ourselves from criminals, from what they would call banditti. We need to stick together if we want to bring political change. So there's a tendency among backcountry people, I think, to want to stick together, not be divided. And therefore, they would be very hesitant to fight each other. So now we can finally get to the Battle of Savage's Old Fields itself. Our major source for talking about it, that we, and especially is Major Andrew Williamson's report. It's particularly important because while we have some other sources, this is one where it's an eyewitness report who we know the author. It's not anonymous. And he was the commander there. So this is really, really important, especially because it's a pretty objective feeling report. He describes how associator forces were assembling while King's friends are focused on maneuver. They're already done assembling for the most part. So this is a key thing we have to think about, is that the associators are mobilizing people and moving them into the backcountry. The King's friends have already mobilized most of their numbers and are waiting. But time is on the side of the associators, right? Because they're going to be able to bring in more and more people, whereas the King friends really aren't. And the Major Andrew Williamson writes on the evening of November 18th how he learnt of a nearby large force of King's men and decided to take a position in the, and I quote, cleared ground of Colonel Savage's plantation, where we could use our artillery, swivel guns, with advantage, and there fortify our camp till we should receive more certain information of their strength. So he realizes that there are the King's friends around, doesn't want to run away, wants to take a good position and learn more about them. And the area that he's going to fortify, I have my back to in this picture, right? This is a picture I took. My back is to his fortification. So this is what the Whigs, the associator forces, would have seen, except there would have been less trees. There would have been less cover at this time. So this is an excellent field of fire. If you want to come in and get the fort they're going to build, you're going to have to run up this. It's a slight incline, but it's enough to slow you down. Remember, the swivel guns can hit something at rifle range, which there's different measures of that, but about 300 yards they can get to. So think about how long it would take to run 300 yards, and you've got a swivel gun firing at you. Remember, I said you can fire that thing 3 or 4 times a minute. Right, so I think it would take at least 1 minute to cover the ground. We'll say there's going to be people with muskets and rifles firing at you as well. There's a good chance that they'll do this thing where you have one guy shoot while other people load, and they just keep passing muskets and rifles up so they can keep up a continuous field of fire. So I just want to point out Williamson picked a very good place. And there's a diorama I built of it. And we'll look more at that later, but that's the Whig area in the south, the Loyalists in the north, surrounding their major position will be at the jail. But Williamson describes how the morning of the 19th, he arrived there at that Savage's Old Fields, and that they had about 3 hours to establish a kind of fortification of old fence rails joined to a barn and some outhouses. And by outhouses, he doesn't mean like a bathroom. It just means like outbuildings. Before they surrounded by a large body of men with drums and colors, right? So they're able to get a position, fortify it, but then as he describes, they're going to be surrounded. The Loyalists, enjoying superior numbers, are then going to seek a parley, and they're going to demand that the Whigs surrender their weapons and disperse. The Whigs don't want to do that, though. So it looks like there's going to be a stalemate and people aren't going to be sure what to do. But then, according to Williamson, fighting broke out when, after the Crown forces demanded the Whigs stay in their defenses, they immediately took 2 of our people just by the fort before my face, whom I gave orders to retake, and a warm engagement ensued, which continued with very little intermission from 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Sunday, November 19th, until Tuesday, November 21st sunset, when they hung out a white flag from the jail. Doesn't mean they're surrendering, it means they want to talk, right? And they'll come up with a truce on the 22nd. Now, the jail that the Loyalists held was a particularly important feature. It was made of brick and could withstand musket fire. And it stood about 250 to 300 yards from the Whig fortifications and was likely the center of the King's Friends' defenses. So I want to note both have pretty strong positions. And it's not clear, but I'm guessing that the Loyalists are also going to fortify their area too. But I also want to note here, this is the first shot we have fired. And it seems like it's more by chance than design, right? It seems like the Loyalists decide they want to take a couple hostages, and then the Whigs are going to try and get those guys back, and someone fires, right? Because they feel threatened, likely. But it's only fighting doesn't break out because someone is ordered to fire, right? Similar to kind of Lexington, right? Where it's not quite clear who fires the first shot, but someone does fire, and fighting then, and then of course other people fire, and now that's done. This kind of tension about what we do next is done. Now we're going to start firing. And then just again to give you a sense of things, this is as if you're standing looking at the Whig fortifications. Now that particular fortification is based on the 1781 battle, not the 1775 battle. They didn't have anything nearly that nice. So the King's Friends are going to try and take the fort. Right. Most of Williamson's report presents the battle as individuals firing behind cover. That makes sense because who wants to charge across mostly open fields into enemy fire? But the King's Friends need to defeat the Associators before they can bring overwhelming numbers to bear. Right. This is not 1781. There's not time or resources for a siege. Right. So there's this idea we gotta end this battle quickly because each day the Associators get stronger. Whereas the King's Friends, our position stays the same, which means relatively we're getting weaker. And here is one of the attempts described in the South Carolina and American General Gazette, a newspaper. On the second day after the engagement began, that's the Crown forces, set fire to the fences and old grass in the fields all around us with an intent to burn up our fort, which consisted only of dry fence rails, and attack us from behind the smoke. But the ground was too wet and saved us the trouble of extinguishing the fire, which we intended to do at any risk. When they found the plan defeated, they set to work and made some kind of rolling battery, behind which they intended to come up and set fire to Colonel Savage's barn and to burn us up. But this they afterwards dropped and set fire to their engine themselves. And this is reported from the South Carolina and American General Gazette. In his account, John Drayton refers to the battery that's in this way. The besiegers endeavored to avail themselves of mantelets, which they constructed for the purpose of approaching the fort and setting it on fire, but not being able to advance them so as to cover their approaches, they were destroyed. So the king's friends do try to think of ways to assault the fort in a way that won't hurt them, right? Let's set up a smoke screen, or basically let's make some movable walls that we can come up behind, and those don't work. So the Associators, though, are also in a difficult position because they're running low on food, water, and ammunition, and they felt that they would eventually have to go on the offensive in order to break the siege, right? So they're in a difficult position. They can't just leave the fort because then the Loyalists would just attack them and they would be defeated. So one account describes how 5 groups of 20 picked men were to approach the king's friends' positions at night and start fires. It's not clear what they would burn. That's why I think that there were other fortifications. It's not clear if you could really easily set the jail on fire since it's a brick building. And it's also not clear what they would do after the fires, whether they would use that as an opportunity to withdraw or try and attack and frighten off the Loyalists. It's not clear, but in the end, it doesn't happen because while preparing for the attack, a white flag appears on the jail. And there's an agreement to parley the next morning of November 22nd. And that's going to lead to another treaty. Each side, I'm not going to go through every part of the treaty, but each side is given permission to contact their leaders, the provincial congress and the royal governor, to ask for instructions about what they should do because they're not sure. All prisoners would be released. Everyone could keep their soldiers together. The Whig reinforcements were also to be bound by the treaty. So remember, the Associators and the Whigs are sending people up to help out against the Loyalists. That's one thing that made the Loyalists nervous and why they had to act soon. And this is saying that those people who were not at this battle have to also respect this treaty. And the Whigs would also surrender the swivel guns. Now, this is shocking since they were key to the survival of their fort, right? Swivel guns were very, very important. But what happens is during the negotiations, the Loyalists surround, a group of Loyalists surround the house where they're having the negotiations and demanding that the Whigs surrender the swivel guns. So that's going to be part of the treaty. But here's the thing. The Loyalists, and I think this is really important, don't say, the Loyalist negotiators, they don't say, oh, I guess you got to give up the swivel guns because there's a mob and they're not going to let you get away with taking them with you. The Loyalists actually say, negotiators actually say, look, you give us the swivel guns, we'll give them back to you in 3 days. That will make the Loyalists happy. Once everyone's calmed down, we can give them back to you. And this is really significant, and especially because the Loyalists kept this promise. Right? Again, I want to stress, swivel guns are extremely important. That's why the Loyalists mob, surround this house saying, give us them. And yet, in order to try and bring peace, the Loyalists, negotiators, instead of trying to use this to their advantage, said, just give us the swivel guns, we'll give them back for 3 days, in 3 days, and then we can just go back to the way things were. Right? This shows, I think, especially the Loyalists really didn't have a strong desire to defeat their enemy in a really strong way, right? They didn't want to crush the Patriots, and so they're not playing hardball. And again, I think it's because these social forces encouraging union. So if we look at casualties, right, Williamson says, our loss was very small, owing chiefly to blinds of fence rails and straw with some beeves' hides, that's cow's hides, erected in the night behind the men who would otherwise have been exposed to the fire of the enemy. We had only 13 men wounded, one of whom is since dead, most of the rest very slightly. The loss of the opposite party is said to be considerable, but he's relying on what other people are saying, right? He doesn't say, we found 20 bodies or anything like that. Major Mason provided more information about the enemy dead, stating that they had but one man dead, who is a Captain Looper, and about the same number wounded as ours. By the best information, they have buried at least 27 men and have as many wounded. I am certain I saw 3 fall at the first fire from our side. Now, again, we only had the name of Looper. Right. Earlier, I mentioned there's also Birmingham from the Patriot side. But notice they don't say, he says, by the best information, they have lost 27. And he says, I'm certain I saw 3 fall. But of course, falling is not dying. And again, my understanding is that 96 has done a good amount of archaeological digs where they have found bodies, but nothing on this level. So it does seem like we've got a couple people dead. The deaths on the Loyalist side are probably exaggerated as no other names have been found, right? We don't know the names of anyone who supposedly died. And this is a case where there's a good chance if you died, they would have been able to find you, right? Because you didn't have like a confusing battle that an army's marching away. They just kind of stopped, right? It would have been very easy to figure out who had died. And of course, people tend to overestimate the dead. Like I said, falling and dying are two different things. So why so few dead? Well, again, we've already known this general tendency, general hesitancy, caused by the tendency towards unity and an unclear idea of what they were fighting for. The associators were outnumbered, so that they knew attacking the king's friends likely would not work, especially as they had a good defensive position. Though the associator fortifications were simple, they were enough to offer basic protection, allowing them to fire effectively on any attack by the king's friends. The king's friends did not have the resources or time to conduct a siege, and attempts to take the fort without a frontal assault failed, and just sniping would not have been sufficient to take the fort or to kill a lot of people. Right? So no one is willing to really take any actions that would kill the enemy, in part because they know that would also put them in serious danger without being able to necessarily win. So we have kind of a stalemate. It's also important to note that their primary experience of war of people in this area would have been with Native Americans. Fighting with Native Americans focused on raids and counter raids and holding a fort, not attacking one. Right? Native Americans typically did not build forts like this, so there would not have been a lot of experience with taking them. Your instinct was to get in your fort and stay there. And again, we have to remember these are basically militia forces. They would not have had the training or desire to launch a frontal assault. Right? These are amateur soldiers, not your professional British soldiers whose whole life is basically dedicated to the military and who are trained and very highly disciplined to be able to be part of this kind of this regiment, this unit. These are guys who really want to go home and take care of their farms and their families. So they're not going to have the training or desire to launch a frontal assault. And therefore, they reach an agreement without trying, which is very different from the 1781 siege of 96, where you have the forlorn hope, where you do have a frontal assault that fails and kills a lot of people. And that's because I would argue that's kind of this professional mindset. So again, we have kind of a stalemate. No one wants to die, so they just kind of call things off. But what if an attack had been tried, right? This is, you always have what if questions with history. Theoretically, the king's friends had the numbers, right? Again, I want to be careful. I'm not an expert on this, and this is a different kind of warfare. But as a general rule, military commanders like to have, if they're trying to take a position, they want a force 3 times greater than the people defending the position, right? So if there's 100 guys defending a place, we would like 300 people if we want to take it. And theoretically, the king's friends had the numbers. Now, we don't have a time machine. We can't go back in time to try and fix things, to try and fight this battle out. We do have the Lander University Experiencing History Lab with its wonderful logo of a bird taking the place of George Washington by a cannon. And this was produced by my son, one of my sons, as our logo. But we do have a group of students. And what happened was I worked with them. I built a diorama and made some miniature soldiers, painted them up, and we refought the battle to see what would happen. Right? So we used some rules, we threw some dice to find out what would happen if the Loyalists would have launched an assault. And what we found was it was really a good idea that they didn't, because a lot of Loyalists died and they failed to take the fort. Right? So if the Loyalists would have on their own tried to assault this fortification, based on our simulation, it would have failed and a lot of them would have died. So they made the right call, it would seem. So we also did an experiment. What if they would have had British regulars, right? What if the Loyalists were not alone? What if they had a group of British regulars helping them? And in that case, we got Bunker Hill results. The British regulars were able to get into the fort and drive off the Whig forces. However, they lost terrible casualties And remember what Nathaniel Greene and George Washington were trying to do, right? If we just kill enough of the British, if we get them to lose troops over time, we will win. And so we had a kind of Bunker Hill result. Now, just for fun, we also then gave the British 3-pound cannons. And it's not called a 3-pound cannon because it weighs 3 pounds. It's because it fires a ball 3 pounds. And it easily destroyed the fortifications of the Loyalists, and that would have fixed things. But of course, they didn't have 3-pound cannons, and it was very difficult to get them into the backcountry. There will be 6 and 3-pound cannons at the Siege of 96, but by that time they have much better fortifications. So what ends up happening, though, to kind of go back to our history, there will be the Snow Campaign led by this man named Roger Richardson of the Associators, and this will lead to the crushing of the king's friends. They don't feel... These men don't feel that they need to accept the treaty that was made of 96, that second one. They say we can go after the Loyalists. Remember I said the Loyalists are going to be relatively weak over time. They also been kind of lulled into a false sense of security. They haven't been organizing well. They've kind of let that lapse. And so the Patriot forces are going to crush the king's friends. And it will be such an utter crushing that they will be very angry about what happens to them. And what this means is that when Charleston is captured later, you're going to have this kind of resurgent loyalism, right? Once Clinton takes Charleston and then Cornwallis begins his campaigns in South Carolina, loyalists like those of the British Legion who have a bone to pick, who are angry about how they've been treated, they're going to be able to start fighting again. And this is going to help lead to a major increase in the violence. So one thing to kind of think about as way of a conclusion, the American Revolution and the American War for Independence were transformative periods for the people who lived through them in ways we might not expect. The backcountry was a relatively peaceful, unified place in 1774. That ends, right? It takes a while to end. The people there don't necessarily want that to happen, but by 1780, it's become an incredibly violent place, right? And that's part of the revolution and its history here in the backcountry.